We're going to do some work in learning about the classical time period. Classical time period ran from approximately 1750 to 1820. The term classical is often used for all Western art music, in contrast with popular music. But when we're talking right now, what we're talking about is classical music as far as from that time period with the characteristics from the 17 to 1800s. At this time, music was seen mainly as entertainment, the wealthy upper class people or the aristocracy, and people of the new middle class, which would have been merchants, hired musicians, made music themselves, and even attended public concerts. As art music became available to all levels of society for the very first time. Vienna, Austria became the most important center for music in Europe. The three main composers that you should know from this time period are these three gentlemen right here. On the left, you have Franz Joseph Haydn, oftentimes known as Papa Haydn. He was a composer that worked for a royal family for more than 40 years. And during this time, he wrote a huge amount of music. He is really the father of the symphony, and he wrote over 100 symphonies. And the word symphony is just a large composition that was written for an orchestra. And the orchestra could be smaller, larger. The size of the orchestra didn't matter. Normally, a symphony was written in 2 or 3 movements. A movement is a separate piece of music that, when it's combined together with the other movements, it becomes one large work. And that these music forms, like the symphony or the sonata, became very popular during the classical time period, and these three men did much with their composing to make that happen. In the center, you see Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and then on the right, you see Beethoven. As you know, Mozart was a child prodigy. He was composing songs that we can still play today, that by the time he was 5 or 6 years old, played the violin, played the keyboard. He wrote all of the types of music that were popular during the classical time period. He wrote symphonies, sonatas, concertos, and he loved opera. He had quite the sense of humor, and that came out very much so in his writing his operas. He died at a young age, penniless, and a sad ending to a life that produced so much amazing music. And then Beethoven, you probably are really familiar with him because of his Ode to Joy, Song of Joy. So many of us have played that from early primer book. That came from his 9th Symphony. He wrote 9 symphonies. He is the composer that, as he aged, he went deaf. So he had all this music in his head and struggled to get it on paper so that other people could enjoy it, but in the end, he couldn't even hear it. Some of the things that you need to know about the classical time period itself was they were very much influenced by a revival in Greek culture. There had been some ruins that had been discovered, I believe it was in the 1740s. And because of this, people became very interested in all things Greek. And that influenced not just their art and their architecture, but it also influenced their music. One of the characteristics from the Greek culture that they embraced during the classical time period was the sense of order and symmetry. And you can see in this picture some of the classical gardens that were constructed at that time. This one is one that's in Vienna, Austria. And in this picture, you can see this was Frederick the Great, who was a king, and he loved music, particularly playing the flute. So in this picture, he's performing along with one of Johann Sebastian Bach's sons. At the keyboard there would be Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, sometimes known as C.P.E. Bach. I'd like you to look at this painting, which came from the classical time period. This is another picture of seeing the order and the symmetry. Let me see if I can scoot back a little bit so you can see even the at the top there where you see all of the vases. They've got them spaced out so they're all symmetrical. And this is a picture of Mozart and his father. If you look over here at the keyboard, there was Mozart at age 14 playing along with his father, Leopold. And over here in the corner, you see the artist, Pietro Fabris, or Fabri, I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce his name. But you can see there that he's got the painting in front of him, and he painted himself into the picture so that you could see his perspective as he was painting this, what he called a private concert party. During this time period, the piano developed into more of the kind of piano that we play today. If you remember, during the Baroque time period, they played clavichords and harpsichords. And in that case, the action, or what made the sound happen, was a plucking action that was taking place. But there were a number of different men who were working on trying to develop a keyboard that would have more sound, that would produce more sound. The person who is credited for inventing the keyboard, which is the type that we have now that has the hammers, if you look inside your piano, if you have an acoustic piano, if you look inside there, you would see how hammers are what are making the sound on the strings. And he called it a harpsichord with piano and forte. If you remember way back to early days, we learned that piano means soft, forte means loud. And it's because this piano could change dynamics. And so it was kind of abbreviated down into the forte piano. And now we just call it the piano. So there was a big change that was made in the type of instrument that was being played, the keyboard music, and the keyboard music itself developed quite a bit as well. We see that the form that now is used more commonly is ternary form. That means a three-part form. So many of you have played these kinds of songs. It would be the ABA type of form. And also during this time period, we saw like the sonata and the concerto. That would be a soloist who's playing along with an orchestra. But these pieces ended up growing, where during the Baroque time period, it was so much of the dances that we saw, and they were just short. Oftentimes when we play those, it's just one page, and that's all the piece there was. But now, music for the piano started to develop, and the flute and other instruments started to develop into bigger works. And that happened during this classical time period. Because of the ability for the piano to make a wider range of sound, composers are putting a lot more dynamic markings into their music. So music ended up having more drama because of the sound that was produced, loud or soft, contrast in the sound. And the texture of the music was no longer the polyphonic music that we saw in the Baroque time period, meaning there were two voices that worked together, but now it became what we called homophonic music, where we would have chords happening in the one hand and then the melody would be in the other hand. So these are some of the changes and some of the characteristics that we find during the classical time period. The melodies were more concise, they had more thematic unity, and they were normally melodies that would include more stepwise motion or diatonic movement than they would be chromatic, not having quite so much half-step movement. So these are some of the things I'd like you to know about the classical time period. And if you could remember that some of the most important composers from this time period were Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, I think then you'd have a pretty good handle on the basics of what was included during the classical time period.